Coming up on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast, we're going to discuss the wide receiver starts and sits of the week using the slot versus wide points per game allowed tool over on Razzball.com. Stay tuned as we talk about the biggest takeaways from week one, starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. It's Friday, folks, and there's only one person I know how to party with on a Friday these days, and that's Ben Wasley, all the way down under. You can follow him at Fantasy First Down, no O on Twitter. What's going on, Ben?
Look, I ain't gonna lie. I started 2 weeks of holidays yesterday, and I'm feeling good. I've got very few Dolphins in my teams. I unfortunately have a little bit of Keon Coleman, which is killing me, but, feeling good about the fantasy season so far. And look, at least at this point, I'm practicing in full. I've got no injuries. I'm feeling good.
Nice.
I'm ready to go for the week.
I am without a doubt limited. I am definitely questionable already heading into week two. I got to tell you, we talked in this offseason, right? And I talked a little bit about James Cook. I have 0 shares of James Cook. Somehow, I was like, I love James Cook. He's like one of my guys. And I have 0 shares of him. And I looked back just to see, like, all right, who did I take? Alvin Kamara, Deebo Samuel were the 2 guys I was taking ahead of Cook. And I don't feel terrible about those just yet. But right now, it's just him and Devin a chain last night. Like, I have a chain in one league, and that's it. And I'm just, like, staring from a distance, like, wondering, like, what happened? Like, I was like, what happened to me? Like, how do you love these players and not have any of them really on your team? It's going to haunt me for a while, but that's okay. Hopefully Alvin Kamara and Deebo do big things for me this weekend, and I will forget all about that. Well, today's show isn't about how bad I am at drafting players I like. It's about the slot versus wide analysis, folks. Today we're going to be breaking down some of the biggest takeaways from our slot versus wide analysis in week one. A lot of this stuff is more trends focused. Ben is dropping his article every single week. It's up on the site right now, discussing his slot versus wide starts and sits, and we'll get to those at the end of the episode as well. But today is really to focus about trends. To be honest with you, the slot versus wide tool is great. It helps break out fantasy points in the slot versus out wide. But the purposes of the tool is there actually actionable trends, and that's really what today's about, to like understand what is actionable. And before we kind of get into actionable stuff for week two, I do want to talk about this Thursday night football. Because one of my takeaways is the Buffalo Bills and how well they've looked through 2 weeks with outside receivers. I mean, Tyreek Hill, and I understand Tua got hurt, but even before Tua got hurt, there's something about what the Bills are doing on the perimeter. I know Jaylen Waddle, I was watching the game, by the way, and Jaylen Waddle was lining up in the slot and getting targets, and I'm like, of course. And I'll like throw the phone because I'm like, all last week, like all his targets were out wide, so I tweeted about it, and of course he's in the slot this week. But it's just something about what the Bills are doing. It's something notable. I do not have their week 3 matchup in handy just a second, but Ben, what's your thoughts about the Bills against perimeter wide receivers? Is it something you're worried about?
I mean, it's something I'm definitely keeping in mind. It's I knew this going into this week. Usually Tyreek Hill is like, the wide receiver 1 in rank when I'm ranking him. And this week I was kind of like, is he 2? Is he 3? Can I put him even lower? Like, the Bills have looked really good at shutting down and trying to keep everything kind of like towards the line of scrimmage and then trusting themselves to kind of like limit big plays. And I think against the Dolphins, that's exactly what you need to do, because the Dolphins are going to be pretty inconsistent, but they're going to have some big plays. If you can limit those big plays, you're going to be really effective. Do they have a different game plan against different teams? I don't know, but I don't think so. It seemed to work so well in the first couple of weeks that I can see them continuing that trend moving forward. And that means it's going to be really hard to start their outside wide receivers against the Bills. And that's exactly what this tool kind of tells us this season.
Yeah. And next week, and this is the best part about having Ben help me out a little bit, I got time to pull up the schedule. Jacksonville has the Buffalo Bills in week 3. That's notable for Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas did find the end zone last week. We'll see how he does this week. Jacksonville is playing Cleveland, so that's another tough matchup for him, which we'll talk about in just a second. All right, let's get into some of the takeaways. The first one I wanted to talk about is the Chicago Bears. Now, the Bears have Caleb Williams and all these receivers now, but I think a lot of us are forgetting that over the second half of last year, the Bears defense really stepped up, got better. And one of the things I've been noticing is they've been tough versus perimeter wide receivers. Last season in 2023, they allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points out wide. And then right off the bat in week 1, they really held down the outside receivers. They allowed the 7th fewest in week 1. This week they have, though, a really tough test on the road against Nico Collins. At home in Houston. They have Nico Collins and Tank Dell on the outside going up against that Bear. So is this something you're actually going to dock Nico and Tank on, or do you think that it's more of a mirage?
I am, yeah. I do think that this has been like an area that they've really been focusing on trying to improve, and I think that we've seen the outcome being that they are legitimately good against outside receivers now, and you do need to take that in mind. I think Tank Dell's a really scary start anyway because he's only playing in 11 personnel. You're not getting enough snaps to really feel good about starting him. You kind of need those bigger plays. You need the game script to go his way. I don't see either of those things happening in this game. I feel like the Texans probably get a lead and the Bears struggle to score against them. And for that reason, I don't think there's going to be a need for them to throw their outside wide receivers. We also know that Nico Collins has had some injury issues this week as well. So there's a lot of dings against both of these guys, and they're going to be pretty scary starts. Collins is someone you probably still have to start, but I don't know. I feel like you got to watch out for anyone playing against the Bears that's an outside wide receiver now.
Yeah, and the other thing too is when you especially have other players like Diggs and even Dalton Schultz to an extent too, there's options for him for CJ Stroud, so he doesn't have to force it to guys like Nico and Tank in this week. But I think this is a really good test for the Chicago Bear defense on the road against Houston. Houston has been very good at home, so if you want to go check out how good, you should go to the home versus away split tool we have on Rasball.com, a really fun tool on the site. All right, let's try the next one. It's the Denver Broncos. And so Patrick Surtain has become one of the best corners in football. And one of the things that we kind of noticed last year a little bit was they have really done a good job shutting down the middle of the field and allowing Surtain to take out their best out wide receiver. But this has opened up an opportunity for number 2s on the outside. Tyler Lockett last week, 6 for 77. So I am a little interested in maybe number 2 outside receivers if Surtain is going to be taking away the top option. DK Metcalf basically was non-existent. This week, of course, they're playing against the Steelers, so this might not be actionable this week. But upcoming games, of course, you got Tampa Bay with Jalen McMillan, even Chris Godwin to an extent on the outside. The Jets have players like Mike Williams, etc. But what's your thoughts about this takeaway? Do you think there's something there?
I mean, Patrick Surtain is very, very, very good. I think that was pretty obvious when he got drafted. We knew how good he was, and he's continued to prove that every single time. He's very good at traveling and shutting down the top wide receiver. I think the main takeaway here is try to avoid starting top wide receivers against Surtain if you've got viable other options. I'm going to be dropping anyone playing against Surtain down in my rankings. George Pickens is already going to be scary this week with Justin Fields starting, but I think this means that you just absolutely can't start him this week.
Yeah, so, and well, I will say this. Listen, Pickens had a decent game last week. I'm not worried about Fields in general. He locked in last year to DJ Moore, but this is the week where I'm not going to bother. It's a Surtain thing. By the way, especially when you have a clear alpha like Pickens, Surtain's going to go to him. He's not going to go to Van Jefferson. So I guarantee you're going to probably have to downgrade him to maybe at best a wide receiver 3 in this matchup. All right, so down to Detroit. So Detroit has been getting gashed across the board. You beat them through the air, but really in the slot, they have been really weak. In 2023, they allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the slot. This past week, of course, Cooper Kupp, 11 for 94 and 1 out of the slot. And the best part, too, is this week they get Chris Godwin. Has this kind of trend got you excited for Godwin this week? Is he a must-start for you?
He is, absolutely. And you'll see in the slot versus wide article, wide receiver starts versus sits, which you can find on the website right now. You will find that Chris Godwin is one of the guys I'm really excited about. Now, to be clear, he's not starting in the slot quite as much as we maybe thought.
By the way, dude, I was expecting like 70%. I'm like, oh, sweet, this is gonna, and then he's like 40. I was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, supposedly, he's going to play in the slot so much this year, and he did in the preseason as well. So I don't know if that was just a week 1 thing, but surely they know like this is a really weak matchup. Chris Godwin is really our slot receiver. I expect he's going to have another big game. He's a definite start for me. He'll be a wide receiver too. I'm starting him ahead of a lot of like other solid guys that you'd usually be considering because I think that upside is just huge in this matchup. I feel like it's going to be a really high scoring game. In my streamers and stashes earlier in the week, I had both Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield as my streamer quarterbacks, just because I feel like this is going to be a total shootout. I feel like you want all of the kind of like the valid wide receivers, all of the quarterbacks, probably want the running backs. It's just going to be a game that's going to be very interesting to watch and going to be really good for fantasy.
You know, it's funny too. Mike Evans, by the way, half of his targets came from the slot last week, which is interesting. But so Mike Evans, by the way, you're always starting Mike Evans. He's been fantastic, even with Baker. But the interesting thing is like Jalen McMillan was moved around a little bit to the slot too, but he was not targeted as much, but he did catch his touchdown out of the slot. So clearly all these guys are getting rotated in. And by the way, you just brought up a really good point. This could be a really fun game in Detroit. So you know what? If you're really desperate, guys like McMillan and deeper leagues could be in fantasy, but I love Baker as well. It's a really good call there. All right, let's jump down to the Green Bay Packers. And so something I'm going to be monitoring, they are a little bit weaker. They're becoming a slot funnel defense. We've kind of seen with guys like Jair Alexander, who did get beat for a long one in this game. But for the most part, they are pushing things down into the middle of the field. Last season, they allowed the 11th most fantasy points to the slot. And they did allow a solid day to Devonta Smith, who actually is now the slot receiver for the Eagles, which is awesome. 7 for 84 in that game. This week, the Packers are facing off against the Indianapolis Colts. Now, that's like an A.D. Mitchell, probably with Josh Downs still out. Is there any interest in taking advantage of this matchup, or do you think you're going to have to take a wait-and-see approach?
I find it really hard to trust Mitchell at the moment. I don't really know what they're doing with their wide receivers at the moment. Having said that, there's worse like desperation style deep starts out there. There are going to be leagues where you've lost T. Higgins, you've lost Christian McCaffrey or whatever, and you're just really stuck and you need someone to start. I mean, after week one, Mitchell's going to be available in a lot of leagues, and he's the kind of guy that's probably in that wide receiver 4 conversation, so he is probably a valid starter for some people.
Yeah, and the weirdest part is like there's already a very low route participation for the Colts in general. And so if you go into their routes, it's like 13, it's 20, 18, 20. It's not a lot of routes. Slot routes are not a lot there. So I don't even know if this is actionable for this week. So I would say that this is definitely one you're going to have to put on the back burner. They got Tyler Boyd in week 3, we'll see what the deal is with DeAndre Hopkins still getting kind of acclimated. But there really isn't that many notable. But in week 5, of course, they get Cooper Kupp. So we'll see. Of course,
to be fair, the Colts only played 45 offensive snaps last week, which is the lowest in the league. So maybe that increases this week, although I do think that's partly intentional. But it is possible that if they play closer to 60-something snaps, all of a sudden these guys are running 30 to 40 routes, and all of a sudden you feel a little bit better about them. But it's still awkward.
Yeah, and that's another key point. We're not really talking about it today, but some stats do get inflated because some teams were playing catch up. There's, plenty of scenarios of that where, teams threw the ball a lot more than they will in regular games. So don't get caught up necessarily in the final total stats. Some of it has to take a step back and say, all right, what is actually a reasonable amount of pass attempts for a team normally? And we should have a show about that, but today is not that day. All right, moving on to the next one. We're going to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Great matchup for outside receivers. In 2023, they allowed the 5th most fantasy points out wide. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill had monster days in week 1. This week, though, talk about hopeful bounce back. Amari Cooper and Jerry Jeudy get this matchup. No David Njoku. Is there a chance you're going back to the well with Cooper and maybe even Jeudy?
I love Amari Cooper. I loved Amari Cooper going into this season. I loved him going into last season. I've loved Amari Cooper probably since his inception. Realistically, I'm just a big Amari Cooper fan. I think he's going to be fantastic this week. This is a really good matchup. We need to see them step up and pass the ball properly. It was very difficult last week against the Cowboys. Always going to be a big challenge. This is not a challenge at all. They should be able to throw the ball reasonably well. Look, realistically, they can probably run the ball reasonably well. I feel like they're going to be able to move the ball in general. I feel like Cooper's the guy that you're going to be able to trust. Jerry Jeudy, not so much. He was playing behind Elijah Moore last week. Moore was mostly playing in the slot, which is a little bit wacky. He was like 75% in the slot, but he was also playing a whole heap more snaps. So I don't know if they're just easing Judy into the offense, but I don't know why they would be. I know this was his first game with the team, but it's not like he just arrived. Like, they traded for him ages ago. He should be embedded in the offense, and he seems to be their wide receiver 3 now. So I'm not sure that I can trust Judy, but I definitely trust Cooper. I'm starting Cooper in pretty much every league.
Yep, that's a good call. Yeah, you got to go back to the well. I mean, Deshaun Watson was an absolute dumpster fire last week, but at the same time, Cleveland, the Dallas secondary, Diggs is a solid player. I don't know what to make of the Watson situation just yet. He did show some signs with Cooper last year. I don't know why there was a huge regression, but Dallas, by the way, Mike Zimmer was an underrated defensive hire. This guy has been one of the best D coordinators for a long time. Now you give him the talent. By the way, no offense to Dan Quinn, but Dan Quinn never had the defenses that Mike Zimmer did, and he made these defenses look like awesome. Mike Zimmer can make this team legit. So I do think maybe Dallas' secondary, which we'll get to in a second, or we already did. I don't even remember. We passed out, but they might be really good against receivers now because of Diggs being back as well. So I do think that there's something there. Start tomorrow. I'm going to have him in my lineups this week. All right, quick question, Camden Harris. PPR, I love this because that's a joke. We always ask for the format, but it's an injury question. Good for you, Camden. Love that. We have seen A.J. Brown injury. Yeah, he popped up with a hamstring injury on Friday. Those are always worrisome. I don't, as of today, I wouldn't really worry about it too much, but Philadelphia this week has the Falcons. AJ Terrell, that could be a little, if he's bound, has a limited hamstring. Ben, thoughts about AJ Brown and a bum hamstring playing against the Falcons?
Well, the biggest concern for me is he plays on Monday night. And you don't really want an injured player. I mean, we saw exactly what can happen with CMC last week. I feel like if you're planning on playing AJ Brown, you either want to hear a report by Sunday that says, oh, he's good, he's going to play. You want to hear a report that says he's not good, he's not going to play. You don't want to hear that, but obviously you want to hear something. If you don't hear either of those things, you need someone on your bench playing on Monday night. You need to pick up a Darnell Mooney or a Ray McLeod or something like this. Someone that you can slide in at wide receiver, not Jahan Dotson, even though I guess if Brown's out, he's a viable option. But I'd personally head towards the Falcons receivers because we know, when we're going to talk about this in a second, that the Eagles matchup is good for wide receivers. So if you pick up a Mooney or a McLeod, you can feel a whole lot better about deciding you're going to start AJ Brown than seeing what we hear before Monday night.
Yeah, I would say put him in your flex if you can. Open up some more opportunities, tight ends, running backs, etc. Obviously, the running back situation is going to be tough unless you have like Tyler Algier, which I don't even think is that viable. But in a full PPR, Darnell Mooney is probably your best bet there. All right, Kansas City Chiefs, vulnerable to the slot, allowed the 12th most fantasy points to the slot last year. Now, this is unconventional just because Isaiah Likely was the main slot receiver last week with Mark Andrews. And the tight end situation, I don't know what to make of this just yet because the Ravens are not a normal offense because of the two tight end sets. He had 4 for 71 out of the slot, Likely did last week. Mark Andrews did run the most routes out of the slot, so maybe there isn't much. But Kansas City this week has Cincinnati, which Yoshivash could be a fun, interesting name with T. Higgins out this week. What's your thoughts about this potential matchup?
I mean, I hoped that Yoshivash was going to be solid this season regardless because he is taking over that Tyler Boyd role. I was hoping he'd step into that sort of, what we expected from Boyd, like very low-end wide receiver 3, maybe into wide receiver 4, someone you can use on a bye week. We didn't really see that. He wasn't getting the sort of consistent usage that we'd hoped for. I mean, he was out there on, 51 of their snaps when they only played in the 50s. So realistically, he's on the field. He's just not running routes a lot of the time. They're trying to run the ball. It's all a little bit messy. They know the offense isn't really working. I don't feel good about the Bengals in general. So Yoshivash isn't someone that I'd feel good about starting this week despite the matchup. I feel it's there's too much risk there and the upside just isn't there.
Yeah, they got Atlanta and then the Chargers after that. So maybe Ladd McConkey will give us a real insight on that one. All right, jumping down to the Rams. In 2013, look at that, going back decades now. 2023 top 8 matchup. By the way, when you said before, I love Amari Cooper since inception. I always thought like you're just like next to his parents' bed, just like, yeah, get it.
I was so excited. Touchdown! Yeah,
Nice, all right. I love it.
Yeah.
Highly inappropriate. We're moving on. Top 8 outside matchup for wide receivers against the Rams. We saw Jay Will last week have an absolute monster game. But another interesting caveat was both Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown did not do much. This could be something to look at. And this week they have a potential bounce back spot for the Harrison-Wilson combination as the Rams face the Cardinals. What's your thoughts about this situation?
Oh, I don't know. It makes me a little bit scared. I can't work out exactly what to make of this offense. Are they going to play the way we expect them to? Was it just a week 1 situation? I feel like guys like Harrison is someone you just absolutely have to start, but you don't feel as good as you did coming into the season. I need to see it now. I feel like I'm in a situation where I really want to see it before I feel good about it.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I would say that the Rams situation is definitely something where Harrison's probably going to be back in my lineups. Wilson, I'm not going to worry about just yet.
Yeah.
I think that Kyler Murray did say I'm not going to force the ball to him, which is fine. Obviously it is what it is. But I think if Harrison does not get it done in this kind of matchup, I'm going to start getting a little worried, even though I don't have any of him in redraft. All right, Saints, tough matchup for outside wide receivers. I mean, Marshawn Lattimore has been in and out of the lineup. He's also hurt again, so that could be a whole thing. But even without Marshawn Lattimore, this defense has been very good at controlling the perimeter and forcing a lot of stuff to the middle. They had the 5th toughest matchup in 23. They shut down Deontay Johnson, which we talked about last week, 2 for 19. Now, this week they get Dallas Cowboys, which means CeeDee Lamb mans the slot, so he shouldn't be impacted, but guys like Brandon Cooks could. Are you fading Cooks after he found the end zone last week?
Yes. I feel like that this offense just runs through CeeDee Lamb, and unless the team's having a really good game or someone's able to effectively shut down Lamb, you're going to see a lot of CeeDee Lamb, and you don't know how much you're going to see of everyone else. I don't think we can totally ignore the fact that Jalen Tolbert's going to get used more some weeks. If Jake Ferguson plays, that's another issue as well. So, look, if Ferguson's out, I guess you're going to have to see some Cooks because they can't give everything to Lamb, but I don't feel great about him this week. He's really the kind of guy that if he's on your roster, you'd want to have a lot of injuries or bye weeks before you consider starting him. He's like a very low bench option.
Okay. Let's shift out to another question here from KJ Frederick. And by the way, KJ, I love it. Bringing the wide receiver questions, you're talking cornerback matchups. This is what I'm talking about. Topical discussions. You know why? Because we have our Sunday live start sit show for 2 hours before kickoff for every start sit question. So if you have a start sit question, running backs, tight ends, quarterbacks, etc., come to the Sunday live show for 2 hours. We're having a lot of fun answering your start sit questions, injuries, everything you need to know up until kickoff. But today's show is focusing on the wide receivers. This is a great question. And so I looked at the data really quick, Ben. I want to get your thoughts on this too. And by the way, they played the Bears in week 1. So this could be kind of manipulated because the Bears have 3 really good receivers. But Snead played over 70% of the snaps on one side of the ball last week. They did not use him all over the formation to shadow DJ Moore, for example. So that is notable. So I am not going to sit Garrett Wilson. However, me and Ben did talk about this last week. The Titans secondary is not the same as it was. They have 2 new cornerbacks, a new defensive coordinator, and last week they showed up and played very well against the Bears. So I am not going to pick on the Titans anymore. That being said, I don't think I'm sitting Garrett Wilson because of Snead directly because I think he'll have plenty of opportunities away from him. What's your thoughts, Ben?
You're totally right. The Titans are the biggest bounce-back defense for me. We talked about it last week. I'm really high on them as a defense this season. Having said that, it's Garrett Wilson. If anything, this is, and I talked about this in the article, this is bad news for Alan Lazard. Like, a lot of people picked up Lazard on waivers. I don't know why, because Mike Williams was on a snap count, and he's clearly going to take over that role at some stage. But if you're planning on starting Alan Lazard for some reason this week, this is really bad news for you, because he's going to see half of Snead. And Awuzie on the other side is not that bad either. Garrett Wilson, you kind of have to start. Aaron Rodgers is going to get the ball to Garrett Wilson. They're going to find ways to use him. He is their top wide receiver, but he's more of like a high-end wide receiver 2 than the wide receiver 1 that you would usually get. So I feel good about starting Wilson, but I don't feel confident. I just kind of feel like I have to because he's a stud, and He's not entirely matchup proof, but certainly you have to have him in your lineup because you're really going to regret it if he does have a solid game, which any stud player is capable of having.
Yep, I agree. I got to give it another week. I know like the San Francisco game was kind of a dumpster fire, but San Francisco is a tough defense. So I'm not ready to anoint the Titans as anything special just yet. Chicago, honestly, Caleb might have just not been as good as everyone thought he would right off the bat. So you got to give the rookie some time. They have a new offense, new players. There's a lot of change in Chicago. So maybe it's a little more to do with the Bears than anything else. All right, let's shift down to Chris Best. By the way, talk about being cocky much. I mean, Jesus, all the other Chris's out there. Sorry, folks, you're at best number 2 in the world. We have the number 1 Chris here live today. Would you trade Neighbors for Marvin Harrison? How times? I remember yesterday when Marvin Harrison was going 4 rounds earlier. It's a wild time. So I can't say for sure I would do this. I would definitely keep. So I mean, I guess you're trading Neighbors to get Marvin Harrison. Maybe I would do that. What's your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I'd do that. Look, it's 1 week. It's really easy to overreact to what we've seen in 1 week. I don't know that we saw enough from Arizona to go, oh no, I absolutely can't even touch Marvin Harrison Jr. But we also didn't see anything from the Giants to go, oh, Malik Neighbors is going to be an absolute star this season. They both had a rookie game. And realistically, I think for both of them, we're kind of still in the same situation, just slightly more nervous than we were going into the season. Harrison's still got to be ahead of Neighbors, even though, admittedly, Neighbors I prefer this week because he has a significantly better matchup.
He ran 50 routes last week, too. So he was on the field. The Giants were just chucking around 66 on those 50 routes. You know, yeah, I'm going to go Marvin Harrison here over Neighbors as well. So there's that. All right, let's get down to the next one here, folks. The Philadelphia Eagles, we kind of already talked about this, but they allowed the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers in 23, the 2nd most points to the slot. Last week, they got completely crushed by Jaden Reed inside, 4 for 138 and 1. Good matchup overall, really in the middle of the field. The question, though, is Atlanta doesn't have a slot guy necessarily. It's actually Kyle Pitts. Does this give you a little feather in the cap for Pitts this week? Is he a start for you? I know it's a tight end, but he does operate mostly in the slot.
For me, I will start anybody against the Eagles. The Eagles have been a fantastic matchup for wide receivers for over 12 months. That obviously continued into this season. The fact that they happened to concede a lot of points last week to the slot, I don't think that's a change in scheme or anything like that. I don't think that necessarily feeds into the season. I think it's just that we do tend to see with the Packers that they feed Jalen Reed a lot when he's having a good game. And that happened. And he starts out of the slot a lot of the time. They just happened to get a lot of effective production out of the slot last week. I don't think that's saying that the Eagles are someone you can only attack through the slot. I think you just attack all players playing against the Eagles. I think every time a player plays against the Eagles, you have to start them, which means you have to start Drake London this week. And realistically, you've got solid streamers, and we talked about this earlier, in Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod. I think they're going to be very underrated this week. I think they're guys you could validly put into lineups if you're in a little bit of a bind, especially, as we said earlier, if you've got A.J. Brown. They're fantastic backups. They'd be the number 1 options as a backup to put on your bench if you've got Brown, knowing that you can slide them in if Brown is ultimately out.
Yeah, and I think the irony is last week they played Pittsburgh, the Falcons, and I think the Pittsburgh Steelers might actually have a formidable defense now, of course. So let's talk about them. That's my next takeaway. The outside receivers really struggled, Mooney and London, against this Pittsburgh. Joey Porter is just another year getting more acclimated. He's becoming a very good corner. They also got Dante Jackson from the Carolina Panthers last year on the outside, and this could be historically, we have seen kind of the Steelers be more vulnerable in the middle of the field. So that is something that worth noting. So maybe you have to fade outside guys against the Steelers. Ben, what's your thoughts this week against Baltimore? You have Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman.
I mean, realistically, you're not starting Rashad Bateman anyway. Actually, I think as an argument, he shouldn't even be on your roster.
Wow.
I know. I went there. Just with the way they're playing, it doesn't look like he's going to be someone they're really trying to feed the ball to. I mean, I think you have to start your tight ends. You have to start Andrews and Likely. And I feel like you have to start Zay Flowers. I feel like he's just such an important part of this offense, even though it's a really awkward matchup. I do feel nervous about all Ravens receivers this week, but you still have to start those 3 guys.
I think I'm downgrading Flowers to a flex. I think he's a wide receiver 3 flex guy. I'm not going to sit him necessarily, but I guess my question is, in this kind of situation, it's still relatively new. The 23 data doesn't necessarily back up that the Steelers are really good against perimeter receivers, like elite or anything. But at the same time, I guess at what point does like a Zay Flowers type, where he's not necessarily a dominant number one, he's not technically a top even 15 receiver, when do you start taking your flyers and starting them over guys like Flowers?
I think ultimately it depends on your situation. You've got to look at your matchup and go, do I need massive upside from this situation? Do I need to go towards a player that has an incredible matchup but has a really low floor because I need to score points against this other team in my league that's amazing? Or did I concede a lot of points to a James Cook or Devin Achane on Thursday night and I just need the upside? Because I don't feel like Zay Flowers is going to give you that upside. I feel with Zay Flowers, you're just going to have a relatively solid, like, I don't know, 7 to 13 points, something like that, where he's going to get some receptions. He's not a real big end zone threat. He's kind of just a solid option. You've got to think, what am I looking for from my players this week? Ultimately, I think you still have to start your better players most of the time, and I don't think this matchup is so scary that I'm totally avoiding Flowers either.
5 for 73 in his lone start against Pittsburgh last year. I think that's the definition of what you're talking about. So not too bad, not great, not too bad. All right, Titans is the next takeaway. We kind of already covered that with the sneak question, so we don't need to go into that. But the last one, of course, is the Washington Commanders. Talk about just a dumpster fire again. Listen, I think Dan Quinn's probably one of the more overrated defensive coordinators in football. I think he kind of walked into a great situation with the Cowboys, and prior to that, his Atlanta Falcons defenses weren't great as a head coach. Last week, they got torched by Baker Mayfield, and Baker might just be the MVP. I mean, maybe it's just Baker is the new Patrick Mahomes. Take a back seat, Patrick. You've been replaced. Look out, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift's going to be dating Kate Otten soon. That's all I know. Anyway, so this week they get the Giants. So maybe there's just hope that Daniel Jones, and by the way, I lost Jordan Love, and I've been looking at Daniel Jones going, he's playing Washington this week. Could be interesting. But going back to that Neighbors Marvin Harrison question, both guys do have solid matchups. Is Neighbors locked into your lineups this week against the Commanders?
I mean, look, firstly, Kate Otten's a really handsome man, and Taylor Swift could do worse. I mean, I won't say I would date Kate Otten, but I'd let my sister. Like, realistically, I think there's something valid to what you're saying there. As for the wide receivers for the Giants, yeah, I'm starting them this week. I mean, look, you're starting Malik Neighbors anyway. I think he's probably going to be ranked in my top 15. I do really think yeah. Okay. Yeah, I went there. I think it's going to be a really good matchup. I feel like this is a situation where you just have to attack the Commanders every week, especially in the slot. Mike Sainristil did not look great there. They've really struggled to get production out of the slot. That continued. They're out wide. They're not great anyway. But Wan'Dale Robinson got 12 targets last week, which is the second most in the league. No, they weren't good. Sorry, I'm just stroking myself.
Nice. You're getting emotional. You're emotional about how good of a start Wan'Dale Robinson is.
It's the Kate Otten things in my head now.
Yeah, you just want to see him happy. We just want to see you happy, Kate.
I love you, Kate. Yeah, look, Wan'Dale Robinson last week got a massive amount of targets, but they weren't very effective targets simply because it was coming from Daniel Jones and they were kind of getting torched. This week, I feel like those targets could become very effective. We could see Wan'Dale Robinson get like 10 receptions for 80 yards or something like that with a touchdown. It just feels like that sort of game where there is a massive ceiling in PPR for a Wan'Dale Robinson. He's probably my favorite desperation start of the week, where he's someone that you really don't want to start, but if you don't have other options, you can pick him up on waivers and feel pretty good about sliding him in there.
Yeah, 40 PPR fantasy points last week. That's what the Commanders allowed in the slot. It was an absolute dumpster fire, including 2 touchdowns. Well over 100 yards. I mean, that is wild. That's impressive. I don't even think of course, that's not even possible season long, but definitely Wan'Dale Robinson is an interesting one. All right, we've already talked about Wan'Dale. We talked a little bit about some of the other guys you like this week. Do you have any notable starts and sits you want to kind of cover before we close out the show, Ben?
We talked about all my starts. I think one kind of like another desperation start. I like to slide in a couple of guys who are guys that you ordinarily wouldn't start unless you absolutely had to, because for whatever reason, you've got a heap of injuries. You just need to get someone off waivers. No one on your bench is available to you. This week, Jalen McMillan against the Lions, I feel like his snap count was really impressive. He was out there for more snaps than Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. He's not their wide receiver one, but they're at least having him out there a lot of the time. He's just not getting the targets yet, but that could easily be in game flow. We don't know exactly what's going to happen this week. For me, he still clearly sits behind Evans and Godwin, but he could ultimately, in this shootout, turn out to be a valid option. So if you desperately need someone, he's available in a lot of leagues. He's someone you can go out and get. And if you're really super desperate, you could just play Juwan Jennings, who is going to get more snaps. He's in the slot against the Vikings. The Vikings are very weak in the slot. We talked about that last week. So there are a couple of desperation starts if you really need somebody, but you're not starting them against your studs. That's if you get yourself in a real pickle and all of a sudden you're like, I just need someone to start. Who can I pick up off waivers and just slide in there? They're two guys that at least have something about them this week that we usually wouldn't appreciate.
Am I losing myself here? Can you hear me? We're good?
Yep.
Sorry, I got cut out for a second. I was going to say, too, there are some, notable, a Jordan Addison, for example, is out. I know you talked about Brandon Powell last week. Now they get San Francisco, probably going to be behind in this game. Any type of deep name Brandon Powell still love, or you moved on? You're emotionally you're over him?
For me, last week they played too much Naylor. They really kind of used Naylor and Powell in a bit of a committee situation. And even with Addison out, I think we're going to see enough Trent Sherfield that I don't feel good about starting any of those guys. And until we see a clear guy that emerges from that group, I don't think you can start any other Vikings, even if you're desperate.
Johnny Munt is probably the guy you're going to want to start. That's probably the only guy that might get borderline tight end one numbers this week, because you only have to have 4 catches for 30 yards to be a tight end one. So, all right, Ben, any notable sits that you want to tell the people about before we close out the show?
Yeah, let's talk sits. Look, we've seen the Jets have very good out wide cornerbacks. We're talking guys like Sauce Gardner and Reed. They're very, very talented. They take on the Titans. DeAndre Hopkins is still dealing with an injury. He's limited. He's not playing full snaps. Calvin Ridley's Calvin Ridley. Will Levis has been struggling in general. I'm just avoiding the Titans wide receivers this week. This is not a situation I want to be involved in. It's a tough matchup. We have seen teams have some success when they've been really good against the Jets. That's not the Titans offense. I feel like this could be a pretty ugly game. I feel like the Titans are going to want to run the ball a lot. You can run the ball really easily on the Jets. We saw that happen last week. I feel like they need to do exactly the same thing. I think we're going to see a lot of Tony Pollard, quite a bit of Tyjae Spears, and very little Ridley and Hopkins. So if you can avoid playing them, you definitely should avoid playing the Titans wide receivers. And the same deal, and we talked about this earlier, with the Jaguars against the Browns. The Browns have their own elite wide cornerbacks. We know they're able to shut down opposing outside wide receivers. That's been happening for seasons now. And they get Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis. Now, for me, I'm never starting Gabe Davis anyway. I don't like Gabe Davis. I mean, look, he seems like a nice guy. I just don't like him as a fantasy option because he runs so many empty routes. He's very much a best ball guy, and there's no way you're thinking about best ball right now. Brian Thomas Jr. might seem tempting, but it's not like he was a massive target last week. He scored a touchdown and he was solid, but this is not a matchup where you want to be risking putting a rookie out against a really good defense who's probably going to be focused on shutting him down. He's not even playing every snap at the moment, so he's an avoid me. And there's one more rookie I'm avoiding as well. That's Ladd McConkey against the Carolina Panthers. Usually I'm targeting everyone against the Panthers, but for some reason, the Panthers are really good at shutting down opposing slot receivers, and that's Ladd McConkey. So for me, McConkey is not a guy I'm interested this week. I know a lot of people are going to be tempted to start people against the Panthers. He's the one guy that I'm not starting this week.
Yeah, the Panthers are much more vulnerable on the ground than they are through the air. Don't know what it is, but they've always been kind of awkwardly good against it. They do have some talent in J.C. Horn in the secondary too, so definitely a good call out. What about DK Metcalf against the Patriots? Do you have any insight about that? Because they are going to be on the road, a West Coast team playing on the East Coast. New England's been very good. They shut down the Bengals last week. Any hesitation about DK Metcalf?
I don't feel good about him. I'll put it that way. He's the kind of player where I'm like, like I have to start him because he's DK Metcalf, but I don't want to start him. It's kind of like an awkward situation. If you've got other valid options, certainly I'd rather start them over Metcalf, but I still think I'm going to end up ranking him kind of like as a low-end wide receiver too. So unless you're pretty strong at wide receiver, you're kind of locked into starting him. I've had some people messaging me questions about, can I sit DK Metcalf for this random bench player? I'm like, no. You can't, because he's still DK Metcalf and he's still going to have the odd blow up game. And that I just don't think the Patriots are so good that you absolutely have to avoid players playing against them. I wouldn't start a Tyler Lockett. I wouldn't start a Jackson Smith and a Jigba, but I would probably still start DK Metcalf.
Okay. All right. Let's get to some questions before we close out the show. Jay Too Nice is just saying, yo, man, by the way, how you doing, buddy? Appreciate you being on the show. And by the way, make sure you jump on Sunday, folks, for 2 hours before kickoff. We're doing our Sunday live start sit show. And by the way, if you haven't been to the Razzball site yet, we have fun tools to help you sit your lineups. We have the slot versus wide points per game allowed tool, must have to use for fantasy. We also have the home and away splits, wins versus losses, a lot of really unique ways to look at, hey, I need to know who I need to start my flex. We're here to help. All right, we got Tyler. Another A.J. Brown question. Obviously, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Tyler, about how, he has the hamstring. He is limited today. That's obviously a worry because he is playing on Monday night against the Falcons. We did recommend that you either pick up a guy like a Darnell Mooney or move him to your flex spot and just have some type of contingency available. But honestly, if you don't find out before Sunday night, it's going to be tough. So we do recommend having someone like a Mooney, for example, ready to go, and or a Tyler Algier if you have him in your flex spot. Start question here, Ben. We got Brandon Cooks. We have Jerome Ford. And then we also have Zach Charbonnet, who, by the way, Kenneth Walker is doubtful this week. So I think Zach Charbonnet is probably going to be the play here. But what's your thoughts, Ben?
I feel like Charbonnet kind of becomes a viable option now. We saw last season when Walker was out, even though Charbonnet didn't have great games, he still got all the touches that you would expect from a number one running back. I don't love the matchup, but those touches really do count. Having said that, Ford was also getting a whole heap of touches last week. They really didn't get Pierre Strong involved as much as we thought. There were a lot of nerves around Donta Foreman getting the goal line carries. I don't know why, given they released him like a couple of weeks earlier and then brought him back. But I still think you probably start Charbonnet. I just feel like, especially in a PPR league, there's more upside there. The only alternative would be in a non-PPR league. I might lean towards Ford.
The one thing about Jacksonville I've noticed over the last year and this year is that they're very vulnerable against pass-catching running backs. They do a lot of receptions. Ford did see a lot of work in the passing game last week and no Njoku. So there could be some more opportunities there for him as well. I actually do like Ford in a full PPR, but Zach Charbonnet just seems like he's going to get just a boatload of work, but they are on the road against New England. So New England did a pretty good job shutting down the Bengals last week, but I think Zach Moss found the end zone at least, so there's something there. So I'm going to lean Ford and PPR, Charbonnet and half if that is enough.
Oh, it's the other way around. That's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Let's say A.J. Brown is hurt. We don't know. We'll just discuss. Oh, and we have a question here about B-Dubs, Mason, Kyron, and Mixon. So obviously we have Mason playing for CMC. They're playing against Minnesota on the road. Kyron Williams on the road against the Arizona Cardinals. And Joe Mixon is at home against the Chicago Bears. What's your thoughts here, Ben?
They're all top 10 running backs for me this week. So congratulations. You've got a really good lineup. Personally, I'm starting Kyron Williams. The Cardinals are terrible against the run, just absolutely terrible. They conceded the most points last season against running backs. This season, I'm expecting that to continue. Kyron Williams is someone that you have to put in your lineups. We saw Blake Corum was just not involved at all, which was really wild last week, honestly. But look, you've got to start Kyron Williams. I know the others are good matchups too. I don't know who's going to definitely score more points of this group. They're all probably going to be pretty good, but Kyron's the one I feel best about.
This is tough. Because the Bears, that's how you beat the Bears too. They're much more vulnerable on the ground. Mixon is an absolute workhorse, and they're home. And so that leads me to go with Mixon playing at home against Chicago. Kyron for me, it just haunts my dreams. It haunts my dreams every day that I moved him down a half a round and I have him in like one league. Watching Blake Corum not get a single touch was just, I don't scream anymore, but there's just this emotional, everything just implodes inwards as I see these things happen. But anyway,
I
I'm
just
gonna
like
go.
the idea that you used to scream a lot and you
I
used to
used to
randomly
scream
walk
all the
around
time. It was
screaming.
just,
Back in my screaming days,
I'm
I don't
married
do
now.
that
I
anymore.
can't scream. I can't scream at things. And my wife would think I'm crazy. I gotta act reserved. When Kyron's getting all the touches, and we were all worried about punt returns, and Blake Corum's returning kickoffs. Oh, anyway, I'm gonna go Mixon slightly ahead of Kyron, but I don't think. Honestly, I would love to hear what your other options are. I mean, because clearly this is probably a running back to flex question, so maybe there's another option there. But join us on Sunday, folks. We're gonna be breaking down all your start sit questions all day long before kickoff. But thank you, Ben Wasley, for joining us once again. Go make sure you follow him at Fantasy First Down. He has a bunch of great content. Ben, tell the people what you got going on at Raswell and everywhere where you rate your stuff.
I mean, firstly, you got to go check out the slot versus wide receiver article. We talked about it, but go into way more detail in the article, so check that out. You can also check out my streamers and stashes from earlier in the week, talking about who you should have on your bench, because a lot of you out there are wasting your bench spots on absolute rubbish. I want to tell you the guys that you should actually have on your bench. Like 3 of my stashes last week are now really good starters this week, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. So go check out the streamers and stashes. Plus, we picked out the number 2 quarterback, the number 2 DST, and the number 2 kicker last week. I feel like you've got to be streaming kickers and DSTs every single week, so check those out too. That's obviously on the Raspball website. Plus, if you just want to hear me talking for an hour about my rankings, that's coming out tomorrow morning as well on Saturday morning, so you can check out my just general ranking show, I guess, on the Fantasy First Down YouTube channel as well. Plus a whole heap of other stuff there as well. So check us out across all the platforms and make sure you're using all those Raspball tools. The Raspball slot versus wide, look, big fan of it. Literally, I was a top 10 wide receiver ranker last week on Fantasy Pros, all because of the tool. The tool improves my accuracy. It's going to improve your start sits as well.
Love it. All right. A little extra promo at the end there. I love every second of that. And by the way, I'm not doing anything. I'm just hanging out. That's all I do now at Rasball. I just hang out. But if you follow me on Twitter at Bobby LaMarco, I'm breaking down the constant takeaways from every single tool we have, bringing all that stuff to you on our social medias. Make sure you follow us across the board at Rasball Fantasy on YouTube, IG, and TikTok. Jump over to rasball.com and check out all the great articles from all our great writers and all the great tools we have and everything you need to win your fantasy league. Thank you for joining me once again, Ben. I'm Bobby LaMarco. We are out of here, folks.